The folio tore free from its binding with a dry crack when the occult researcher slid the brass clasp aside and pushed. Suspicion tightened his fingers as brittle leaves fanned across the table. He did not speak. The young scribe crouched beside him, hands shaking while he brushed dust into a corner. Suspicion drove the researcher to probe the binding with a bone folder. He had come to the archive for a dated ledger. Instead, he found a pressed talisman braided of hair and a slip of folded parchment that smelled of old resin and iron. The first exchange was sharp. "Show me." The young scribe, now Marcus. The researcher set the folio so the candlelight hit its edge. Marcus, the occult researcher, lifted the insert with 2 gloved fingers and flattened it on the table. He kept his face still. The candle flame made a band of bright along his spectacles. He had always kept his pauses exact. The pause now measured the room. They were in the archive's locked alcove. Shelves rose like a stilled forest. A guard had left the door propped by a stone, an oversight the researcher did not mention. He had come with a reason. Late, antique sects and their gnosis. He expected marginal notes, ritual lists, perhaps a line of dangerous metaphor. He did not expect a claim printed in a hand that had sailed across provinces. That certain taught knowledge prematurely aged the soul. It says lifespan exchange for insight, the young scribe read aloud. It says they took years from the body for a certain kind of seeing. His voice hitched on the last words. He ran a finger under the line and left a smudge. Suspicion shifted into doubt. The researcher set the page under a magnifying lens. "They might mean metaphor," he said. Or the scribe wrote in panic. The young scribe looked at him. "Marcus, this gloss is in 3 hands. Look at the ink." The researcher peered. The ink's sheen was wrong. It darkened where breath had warmed the page. He frowned. A third presence arrived before dawn. The rival historian, called Linus, stepped into the alcove with a lamp and a small satchel of instruments. He wore a long coat that still held a smell of horse and coal. "Do not move anything, Linus. This could be a forgery set to shame coffers." Marcus tightened his jaw. "Linus, the young scribe, we need to test this." The folio was sealed for centuries. Why would someone hide a forgery like this? Linus set his lamp on the table and uncorked a vial. He extracted a tiny brush. He rinsed it with a chemical that hissed when it met a film of dust. The researcher watched his hands. He had spent years learning how to read an ink's age by the way it took light. Now the test would force a decision. The rival historian's tone sharpened into accusation. "Marcus, you want this to change everything. You want notoriety. Forgeries are common." "I will not let you publish a claim that kills reputations," Marcus answered without raising his voice. "Linus, if this survives under the testing, we will need to decide what to do with it. Not whether we want a headline." The young scribe folded and unfolded his hands. He had the look of someone who had slept 2 hours and eaten no bread. The first event after the testing decision arrived in the form of a seal sliding loose from the folio's edge. A hair-woven talisman slipped free and landed on the floor with a dry clack. The young scribe crouched and picked it up. "It's braided," he said. "Human hair. See the tiny knots?" He smelled it, then looked at Marcus with a face that had gone pale. He set the talisman on the table and opened the slip. The marginal gloss was terse. It recorded an instruction: ration the sight. Doubt turned into urgency. Marcus read aloud the line the scribe had missed. "Elders ration teachings by measure. Too much seeing shall eat the flesh." He read the phrase twice. Linus frowned. That could be rhetorical. Elders often wrote in aphorisms. Marcus tapped the parchment. "The gloss is practical. It notes times, names, accounting method." The young scribe traced the marginal numbers with a fingertip and winced. The numbers were systematic. The room tightened. They agreed to test authenticity in the annex lab. Marcus carried the folio wrapped in linen to a small room lined with copper tubs and crude lenses. The rival historian set samples and recited methods. "We will test the ink with low heat, chemical wash, and fiber cross-sectioning," the researcher assisted. His hands moved slowly, a habit from years of careful study. He trusted nothing to haste. The young scribe hovered by the lamp and kept whispering the folio's dates. An external event altered the tenor. A retired initiate was brought by 2 hospice attendants. He arrived thin and guarded. They led him into the lab before the tests finished. The researcher did not object. He wanted witnesses. The retired man introduced himself as the former initiate, and he had a voice that carried small desert sands of age. The former initiate's skin had the look of too much sun and too little water. He smelled faintly of medicinal wine. When Marcus spread the folio and let the candle flame brush the aging ink, the former initiate did not seem surprised. He, in a cracked tone, "They took years. We were glad to trade." The researcher watched him study the marginalia trade. The young scribe, "Trade knowledge for life." The former initiate nodded and tapped his throat. "My voice is like this because I bought the vision. My hands, too. I paid long ago." His thumb left a pale smear on the folio's edge. Dialogue quickened. The rival historian and Marcus argued over interpretation. "Linus, you want this to be true because it fits your thesis. You will cut corners for fame," Marcus answered. "I want to know what they did." "That is not fame, Linus. It is duty." The former initiate coughed. "Duty." He repeated. "Duty does not mend what you lose. We were told the price. We were told the measures. Some accepted. Some refused." He closed his eyes as if folding a painful memory into the bones of his chest. An early revelation arrived at midnight in the annex. Linus's preliminary tests returned inconsistent results. The inks were old. The fiber paper carried a mildew pattern consistent with the region. Yet a microscopic residue appeared that neither of them could immediately identify. Marcus peered through a hand lens and said, "This residue is layered like a varnish. It sits above the ink in some places and below it in others." Linus slammed his palm on the table. "So either the writers sealed it deliberately, or someone tampered in antiquity." "Both are bad," the young scribe exhaled. "What do we publish if we publish nothing?" he asked. Emotion shifted again. Suspicion moved toward fear. The former initiate's appearance began to register as a live example rather than a story. He handled the folio badly. When he let his fingertips brush a margin where a philosopher's name stood, the former initiate's face tightened. His knuckles bent. The researcher stepped forward and stopped him. "Do not touch that line, Marcus. Hold your hand back." The former initiate's voice lost steadiness. "A text could take what it names. We were taught caution." He laughed then, a small, bitter sound. The researcher ordered containment. He insisted the folio be kept under glass overnight. Linus argued for chemical stabilization first. The young scribe suggested copying the marginal glosses before any test. They argued in short lines. "Marcus, copy now. Linus, we test now." The scribe, both. The room smelled of heated metal and beeswax. The folio lay like an animal on a table. They moved to a ruined ritual chamber later that evening. Marcus and the young scribe crept down a stone stair that led to a hollow under the monastery. Masked initiates gathered around a shallow basin. They had come to perform a transmission rite the researcher had tracked from the folio's provenance. Marcus kept to the shadows and motioned the scribe to stay quiet. The air in the chamber was close. The initiates chanted short lines and passed a folded paper between them. An elderly participant, labeled in the circle as the elder participant, took the paper with trembling hands. Marcus leaned forward. "Do not step so close," he whispered. "We watch only." The scribe's breath fogged the stone. The elder participant lifted the paper to his face and read. Immediately his pupils shrank. His skin tightened around cheekbones. He convulsed and his left hand spasmed. The masked initiates stopped and dragged him away. The researcher saw marks appear across the man's forearm where ink had touched skin. They were not superficial. The elder participant's wrist bore lines the color of old parchment. The young scribe allowed, "Marcus, his skin, it's—" He could not finish the sentence. Marcus's hands moved to the scribe's shoulders. He kept his voice measured. "We leave now. Take what you can remember." The researcher recorded the event in shorthand on a strip of paper. The scribe's whole body trembled. He would later tell the researcher he had tasted metal when the elder participant convulsed. Back in the archive at dawn, the young scribe brought a single marginal gloss to the table that he said he had noticed in the ruined chamber's paraphernalia. He set it beside the folio. Marcus leaned close and read an elder's note on rationing. It listed names and numbers and times. It spoke not of ritual hazard but of administrative procedure. Counting sessions, limiting exposure, a ledger of those who had refused. Marcus whispered, "They did this on purpose. They rationed insight." Linus nothing for a long moment. An argument became a small, sharp rupture. Linus accused Marcus of wanting to weaponize the discovery. "You will destroy lives if you release this without control. Linus, you do not get to decide who pays." Marcus lifted his hand and put it flat on the marginal ledger. Neither do you, Linus. We decide together, or not at all. The scribe slammed his palm over the folio and said, if they rationed, then they knew the cost. Who chose, who refused? He looked straight at Linus, who chose. Linus's face reddened. He could not answer. The scribe found another entry, then another. A mid-chapter twist occurred when he translated a marginal gloss that listed elder names paired with numbers and brief reasons. Asthma refused, Colin accepted 5 measures, Tyrius refused, executed. The names matched registers in a philosopher's circle the researcher had studied years earlier. The researcher felt a pull in his gut. He had read about a famed late, antique philosopher who had claimed sudden decrepitude after a night of revelation. He had assumed metaphor. Now the ledger tied that philosophers declined to recorded acceptance of measures. The twist changed the researcher's understanding. This was not accidental harm or superstition. It was deliberate policy. Actions accelerated. The researcher demanded they copy the ledger and seal the folio. Linus argued they should publish a cautioning paper. The young scribe, if they published then, they called it obsolescence, to shame those who took more. If we publish now, the same might happen. The researcher looked at inked names on the ledger and felt the chill of responsibility. He made a decision that altered the room. They would not publish without further corroboration. He instructed the scribe to copy the ledger and to take no sample that could be carried off. The scribe nodded and began writing. At this point the former initiate grew agitated. He rose unsteadily and stepped toward the folio. He reached out without asking and brushed the corner where a philosopher's autograph sat. The researcher lunged and caught his wrist. Do not touch that line, Marcus ordered. The former initiate's hand retracted as if stung. He looked at Marcus and said, you saw him. You saw how fast I went thin. I did not do this for attention. His voice broke on the final words. The researcher studied the man. He felt fear again. The former initiate's trembling had an edge of raw demand. Testify what you know, or let this remain sealed. They returned to the archive council room where the folio would be finally handled. Marcus sat with the copied ledger across from Linus and the young scribe. He felt the weight of the room's choice. The elder participant's collapse replayed in his mind. The researcher's hands shook slightly when he touched paper. He forced his hands steady. The climax arrived with a simple, unplanned gesture. Marcus held an autobiographical fragment penned by a famed late antique philosopher, an item he had kept in a sealed docket for comparative analysis, and handed it, out of protocol, to the elder participant who had returned from the hospice for one last look. The elder took the fragment, read a single line aloud, and then touched the philosopher's signature without warning. The man aged visibly in the space of minutes. His hair lost color at the roots. His skin tightened into thin parchment. His voice became sanded and small. The room watched and could not turn away. They rushed to help, but action had limits. The elder participant's breath shortened. The young scribe clapped a hand over his mouth and asked, Marcus, what do we do? The researcher moved with precise, physical motions. He stripped the fragment from the man's hands, wrapped it in linen, and called for ligature to the window to seal the fragment away. Linus shouted orders while he tried to administer a saline of common pharmacy. The former initiate wept openly in the corner. Marcus felt his own hands burn with a heat that was not illness but adrenaline. Short, blunt dialogue filled the room in the aftermath. We should burn it, Linus. We cannot leave such a thing to fate. The young scribe answered. Burning is destruction. We risk losing evidence, Marcus. We will not kill a man to save a text. The former initiate looked up and said, You will not both save and be safe. Choose. The room held a single long silence that tasted of iron. They attempted containment. Marcus moved to destroy the fragment with a lead plier and a flux torch. The young scribe lunged and grabbed his wrist. Marcus, stop! The researcher pulled his hand away and said, Hold him. We cannot both keep the text and let a man die in front of us. The scribe's fingers were tight. Linus shoved the scribe aside, and the scribe let go with a sound like a struck chord. A struggle followed, 3 quick exchanges of grips, an overturned stool, a lamp scattering wax on the floor. Someone knocked the folio box. It slid across the table. In the scramble, the young scribe slipped a narrow scrap of sigilled paper into his sleeve without explanation. The moral rupture was immediate. Marcus cursed softly and pushed past the others. He moved to secure the fragment and the folio. Linus followed and tried to take custody of the papers. The former initiate reached out and, with a voice like a sanded reed, said, "If a text eats a life, then the text is a weapon. Who holds a weapon decides who lives." The scribe would later tell Marcus he could not watch the torch strike paper. He had put the scrap in his sleeve because he wanted a sample to take to a physician who would not ask questions. By morning, the elder participant had sunk into a stupor and then gone. There was no dramatic death scene. He simply grew still and pale as a clay sketch. The folio was resealed. The Archive Council argued and finally agreed to hide the folio again among the stacks in a sealed crate with new evidence of a flood to justify the crate's absence. Linus insisted on official notes that would prevent outsiders from stumbling on the record. Marcus accepted the compromise with clenched teeth. The final paragraphs move with concrete actions. Marcus pocketed the copy of the marginal ledger and folded it into his coat. The young scribe slipped silently away to the apothecary with the tiny sigilled scrap in his sleeve. Linus organized the crate and assigned 2 guards. The researcher stepped out into a pale morning that smelled of wet cobbles and stale straw. He walked with the folio's weight on his mind and the ledger's names under his fingers. He had orders to protect the archive's reputation. He also had a private obligation to truth. He tightened his grip on the satin ribbon that held his spectacles case. The chapter closes on a concrete beat. Marcus paused at the archway and turned back. He pressed his palm once to the sealed crate where the folio lay and then walked toward the street. The young scribe had already left by another gate. Marcus folded the tiny sigilled scrap the scribe had left in a corner of his desk into his sleeve and stepped into the morning light. He had not solved the question of whether knowledge must always be paid for in years. He had, however, chosen to trace the ledger's names himself rather than destroy the record. The choice closed the chapter and opened a path he could not yet name. Emotion, root, suspicion. Emotion, shifts, suspicion, doubt, urgency, fear, resolve. The chapter contained multiple named characters. The occult researcher Marcus, young scribe, rival historian Linus, former initiate, elder participant, each influenced events across scenes. The marginal gloss twist changed the researcher's understanding and forced the moral rupture that ended with the folio resealed and a sigilled scrap hidden for future tracing. The young scribe lurched forward between 2 narrow stacks and a strip of hair along his temple whitened and puckered as if burned. He pressed his palm to the side of his head and a single wordless sound left him. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw before he could name it. He stepped in and braced the scribe's shoulder against frescoed stone. "Young scribe, speak clearly." The researcher, "What touched you?" The scribe's fingers shook as he pointed to the leather folio he had carried, and the researcher felt that first, precise movement of the problem. Contact with the book produced immediate bodily change. He had found the folio hours earlier, when it tore free from its binding with a dry crack and brittle leaves fanned across the table. That memory sat beside his hands now like a tool, not a story. The researcher crouched, eyes on the scribe's hair and scalp, counting the fine gray lines that appeared from temple to ear. Suspicion drove his motions. He moved faster, stripped the folio from the scribe's hands, and slid a scrap of cloth beneath it to isolate the object. He had spent his adult life measuring oddities. Tonight, measurement had to come before explanation. They were in the frescoed archive corridor, late evening. The corridor's painted saints looked down with flaked gold leaf, and a single oil lamp swung at the end of the passage. The young scribe's breathing came shallow and quick. He did not look like a man struck by fever. His skin creased near the temple, small folds forming where no folds had been a moment before. The researcher pressed 2 fingers to the scribe's wrist and found pulse quick, capillary shallow. His own palms smelled of book glue and resin. "Mara!" he called, and Initiate Mara appeared from the reading alcove with a lamp still in her hand. Mara's eyes flicked to the folio and then to the scribe's temple. She reached out with deliberate fingers and touched the page's edge, then drew back as if burned. "We should quarantine it, Mara." The researcher nodded and eased the folio into a locked alcove. He set the lamp at a low distance and tapped his pocket watch to note the time. He recorded the immediate fact the way a surgeon marks a pulse, a physical assault on anyone who brushed presence of those leaves. That knowledge rearranged the decision in front of him. contain the object, or study it while people remained vulnerable. They carried the scribe into a small locked alcove. Mara took his hands and tried to steady his breathing while the researcher examined the folio margins with a brass lens. The margins were dense with tiny glosses. A fresh, oily residue smeared several folio edges and, beneath the residue, a marginal gloss in a cramped, unfamiliar hand suggested a short ritual formula and an instruction for mitigation. The researcher traced the letters with a gloved thumb and felt a slight tack like resin under his glove. He ordered Mara, seal thin sheets in wax. Cashin must be told. He did not trust the scribe to travel through the hall with the folio in his grip. There was disagreement before there was strategy. Mara argued for greater distance. We must move him to the infirmary and lock the folio in the chest of sequestration, she said. The scribe's voice trembled. Please, don't let it take more. Master Cashin's boot on flagstone announced his arrival before his voice did. He stepped into the alcove, lamp held high, and his face was a map of judgment. What have you brought in here? Master Cashin demanded. He looked at the scribe, at Mara, and finally at the researcher. His tone was clipped. You, researcher, have been warned about hasty handling of damaged codices. The researcher did not wait to defend himself with speech. He placed the folio on the table and spread his hands. He spoke slowly so Cashin could hear the facts. This folio reacts on contact. The scribe's temple changed where he brushed the binding. I have the residue and a gloss that implies mitigation. Cashin leaned forward and tapped a finger on the page. And you propose to test it here, he said. The shift between threat and doctrine in Cashin's voice moved through the group like a current. Cassin's accusation sharpened into a rapid exchange. You disregarded protocol. Cashin, you endangered apprentices. Mara shot back. Master Cashin, we can study this safely. The researcher replied, no, Cashin, you study behind closed doors. We destroy dangerous items when they harm the living. The scribe cried out, stop arguing and help me. The researcher held the scribe's gaze and spoke so the others could hear. Destroying without understanding kills what might keep others safe. We must observe a small controlled reading. That line drew a hard breath from Cashin. The argument did not end with words. They erected a quick quarantine. Wax seals across the alcove door, a small brazier on the table to keep air moving, the folio on a raised lectern. The researcher selected a short aphorism from the marginal gloss he judged least likely to provoke. He wrapped his fingers in thin treated cloth and set a single candle near the page. Mara stood behind him and Master Cashin paced the alcove perimeter. The researcher read aloud the short line, enunciating precisely. He watched the letters as if they were physical actors. The page's ink did not blur, but individual strokes lifted a millimeter from the paper surface and trembled. Candlelight guttered. A scrap of paper on the table curled at one corner, then flowed into granular ash that settled in a tiny mound. The ash collapsed inward into a small hourglass shape with minute ridges of script across its surface. Mara exhaled sharply. The scribe's fingers creased at the knuckles. That experiment changed the room's temperature the way a window's opening can let a draft through. It converted their fear into an explicit mechanism. The text leached measurable, visible matter into forms that resembled the passage of time. Cassian stopped pacing. He raised his lamp and then moved it toward the brazier. This is worse than foolishness, he said. It is contagion. The researcher set down the lens and wrote the observation in a quick hand. Letters lift. Matter reconfigures into ash, hourglass. Contact correlates with local tissue folding. After that demonstration, decisions collapsed into urgency. Mara collapsed into motion. She moved to bind the folio in treated cloth and to index every marginal gloss. Cassin demanded burning. Burn it now. Cashin, I will not let apprentices carry this hazard through our halls. The young scribe burst out. Master Cashin. Waiting will not help him. He clutched his temple and muttered numbers. The beginnings of a recitation he could not finish. The researcher placed a hand on the scribe's shoulder and felt the small, rapid trembling under the skin. He thought of the folio's earlier liberation from its binding and how the book had arrived at the table like an open wound. In the dim reading alcove, the young scribe slipped a single leaf into his sleeve while the others argued. He moved with the nervous, furtive motion of someone who tells himself there will be time to replace what he has taken. The researcher caught the thief's shadow in his peripheral vision and reached out. The scribe's hand came away with a paper edge, and a pale thread of change began at his temple. Stop, the researcher, flat. He felt a new, sharp shift in the room, suspicion seeded now by worry and then by the knowledge of theft. They argued again, sharper and faster. You stole a page. Cassian, young scribe, you betrayed protocol. Mara, Master Cassian, listen. The gloss suggested a mitigant. The researcher, we can isolate text, copy it, test it without exposing more people. Cassian's reply was a clipped set of demands. No. We seal and burn anything that harms the living. That is my order. The scribe's voice rose. Please, Cassian, don't send me away like I am already old. The line landed quiet and severe. The researcher took the copied fragment and set it under a glass. He moved the lamp close and recited the gloss for mitigation in a careful, even cadence. The letters lifted, and a lattice of thin runes spread like an inked web across tiled floor and over the underside of the lectern. The lattice held light between its lines. For a moment, it looked like a diagram. Then the lattice squeezed something from the air, and a spiral of pale motes coalesced overhead. Mara reached out to steady herself, and then convulsed as her hands knuckled and fingernails shortened into ridged crescents. Her voice broke into a croak and her shoulders slumped. That instant became the chapter's midline cliffhanger. An attempted mitigation had instead taken from Mara in accelerated motion. The researcher dropped the glass. Mara, he said. He moved closer and felt the heat of old age in her skin, the dryness, the papery shift at her wrists. The scribe whispered, I didn't mean, and the room's air filled with a sound like a distant bell struck wrong. Cassian slammed his fist on the table. Seal it, he shouted. The researcher had to choose. Burn the folio and any copy, ending its immediate threat, or preserve the copy to isolate language and test for an antidote. He thought of the scribe's stolen leaf and Mara's convulsion. He thought of the hourglass ash from the earlier experiment. He could burn what they had and be rid of immediate risk, but he would also lose the only remaining textual lead. He looked at Mara's hands and then at the smoldering edges of the copied fragment. He spoke between his raised palms. Cassian, if we burn everything now, we guarantee no one else touches it, but we lose any chance at a remedy. If we preserve a single copy under strict seal, we might discover a true mitigation. Cassian answered, you always believe in tomorrow's method. Today we have people in front of us who are harmed. The scribe's voice rattled. Please, he said, please don't burn it all. Mara's lips moved, and she tried to form a sentence. If we can find the root, her voice failed halfway through. They moved in a sudden, decisive set of actions. The researcher took the folio off the lectern and thrust it into the brazier. He struck a flint, and flame licked the leather. Cassian forced a corner of the copy into the fire as well. The heat flared up, and the brazier's bellows sent a wave of smoke. The folio blackened, ink blistered, and a strip of marginalia curled into ash. The researcher did not let the blaze run. He snuffed the flame when the folio was reduced to a charred board and a blackened stack of leaves. He folded one smoldering fragment into treated linen, then sealed it in a small chest and fastened wax seals across the lid. He pushed the chest into a pillared alcove and placed his signet ring atop the wax for authority. When the smoke cleared, Mara breathed. She had not returned to her earlier form. Deep lines scored her cheeks and her hand trembled with a motor tic. The scribe's temple bore a permanent pale streak. Cassian stood with his back to the brazier and watched the chest. You made the right call, he said to the researcher, but his voice contained a notch of reservation. I will report you both to the council. You risked lives, the researcher answered without flourish. I recorded the procedure and the results. The copy exists only sealed. You will find my observations in the ledger on the south table. He did not argue the ethics further. After the violent episode, evidence became their anchor. The researcher wrote down measurements in a steady hand. Time of initial contact, nature of tissue change, the ash hourglass geometry, the lattice reaction and its correlation with vocalization, the partial reversal when the fragment was burned. He listed names. Young scribe, initiate Mara, Master Cassian. He noted who had touched what and when. He closed his notes with a single instruction for himself. Continue with controlled replication, but do so away from apprentices and with full mask and gloves. Master Cassian withdrew to report, his lamp bobbing away down the corridor. He paused at the arch and looked back once, then left. Mara sat with both hands on her knees and took off her spectacles with trembling fingers. The scribe whispered, "I should never have taken that page." The researcher put a hand on the scribe's shoulder. He did not offer false consolation. He offered procedure. "Rest now," he said. "I'll prepare the measures you must follow before you return to the infirmary." He did not say he would carry guilt. He made a plan. At dawn, the chest remained sealed with wax and the smoldered fragment inside. The folio's main body was charred and held only a few legible letters. Mara survived, altered. The scribe bore partial irreversible aging at his temple. Cassin left to report the incident. The researcher recorded precise observations, instruments laid out. A brass lens, a small brazier, ink, a smoldered scrap in a sealed chest, and the imprint of the hourglass, ash preserved in a glass vial. He set his pocket watch alongside his notes and wrote, in a single line that balanced fact with a choice. Human cost acknowledged. Continue study with greater containment. He closed the alcove door, placed the wax key beneath his brass signet, and strapped his leather satchel across his chest. The chest seal bore his ring impression and a neat loop of red wax. He walked back past the frescoed saints toward the south table where he had left the ledger, each step measured. The decision to continue was not a promise of triumph. It was a concrete plan tethered to a charred object and a sealed copy. Outside the archive, dawn pulled at the edges of the city. The researcher paused at the stair and put his hand to the small talisman hanging from his neck. He did not speak. He wrote one final instruction across the top of his observations. Notify only those with authority to contain and research. Then he closed the ledger and carried the weight of evidence forward, with the same deliberate motion he used when lifting vellum from a table. The chapter of tonight's events ended in a sealed chest and in a decision recorded in ink. An active choice to preserve what had harmed them so that the next step could be measured and controlled. Books crashed over the library balcony, and the young scribe fell back against the rail, hands pressed to his temple where hair had gone white along a strip of skin. Suspicion tightened the researcher's jaw as he lunged, fingers closing on a single fanned folio before it tumbled into the dark. The scribe kept gasping, no words, only a thin, raw sound, and the archivists who had been shelving papers froze with dust on their fingertips. Within 5 breaths the central problem stood plain. The folio had aged the scribe in minutes, and someone had to decide whether to preserve the text or destroy it. The researcher shoved the brass clasp aside and set the folio on the lectern with a hand that did not tremble at first. He had read fragments before. He had not seen this ledger. Suspicion began as a pull at his throat and turned into measured study. He checked the edges for water stains, the binding for repairs, the marginalia for annotations in different hands. He remembered the folio's tear in the previous vault, and the way the young scribe's hair had puckered at the temple earlier that night. Those memories flashed as specific images. The clasp clicking, the scribe's hand brushing dust into a corner, a page that smelled faintly of coal and resin. What happened? The archivist demanded. The archivist's voice was short. He kept his sleeves rolled and his palms clean. How did this happen here on the balcony? The folio, the young scribe managed, each syllable a struggle. I read the line and it took years. His voice at first was brittle. Then it thinned into a whisper. He pressed his fingers into the hollow just beneath his eye and flinched, as if the skin did not belong to him. The researcher tightened the strap of his satchel and answered with a clipped rhythm, "Stand up, scribe. Name the passage." He did not ask for feelings. He for the concrete. Which paragraph, what phrase, which marginal note? The scribe pointed with a hand that shook. Margin 3. The ledger line, 12 counted for the reading. I read it and my wrist burned like a strike. He looked at the researcher with eyes that had lost focus. I can feel my hands folding. They moved him away from the ledge. The archivist, a broad-shouldered man named Cassin, kept glancing at the ceiling where the stacks rose like teeth. Cassin had the authority to deny access. He wore his decision like a weight. We should seal it, Cassin. We should record it and lock it in the restricted vault. His hand hovered over the folio as if to claim custody. Cassian, the researcher quietly, we catalogue only after we understand the mechanism. If the ledger is ritualized, sealing it without knowledge risks a repeat. Suspicion, then a shift to sharp caution, moved through him as action. He set the folio under the lamp and flipped to the margin the scribe indicated. The notation was a ledger, names, dates, and a column of short strokes beside passages. The ink varied, some entries older, brown and faded, others black and damp as if written minutes ago. The folio recorded losses in years alongside phrases that read like reading cues. This is not a curse at random, the researcher, this is accounting. Cashin's fingers tightened on the rim of the table. Accounting for what? The researcher read aloud, slow and exact, each short sentence to keep panic at bay. When the reader witnesses the final tally, year is seeded, ledger binds. He stopped and replaced the page. It names lives and measures them. The room shifted toward conflict. The young scribe had been brought to a small, low-lit chamber where only one lamp burned. He sat on a stool and pinched the edge of his sleeve until the cloth whitened under his grip. "I did not mean to," he said. "I only wanted to know the phrase at the top. I thought knowledge would explain the marks in the margins." His words came fast, wrong for the urgency of the moment. Cashin's voice rose. "You should have left it. You should have trusted the seals." His cadence was clipped, precise. The argument began with 3 short lines. "Cashin, stop." The researcher intervened. "We need the ledger. Not to keep it, but to understand it." He placed both palms on the table and leaned forward. "Why understand?" Cashin snapped. "Understanding keeps it alive. Destroying stops it now. Destroying might disperse the ink and spread the means by which it reconstructs." The researcher countered. "We need evidence." The scribe looked between them and then toward the folio. "Please," he said to both men, "please do not make me this proof." The tension shifted into bargaining. Cashin argued procedure. The researcher argued caution. The scribe pleaded for reprieve. The conversation tightened like a rope, then snapped when a soft metallic scraping echoed from the vault corridor. A masked figure appeared in the doorway. A masked initiate whose robes were matte black with antique gold threads. He moved without the clumsiness of a thief. His entrance was rehearsed and cold. He carried a small satchel and a pendant that caught the lamplight with a dull flare. The initiate removed his mask for a moment to speak. The voice was close, mouthed and controlled. "Archivist Cashin," he said, naming the man as if placing him in a ledger. "You argue preservation. The sect argues distribution. This folio is currency." Cashin's jaw worked. "What do you mean by currency?" The initiate's fingers tapped the satchel. "Knowledge here is transferable. A ritual binds years moved from one vessel to another. The ledger is proof. The marginalia is instruction. We offer a ritual to bind that transfer permanently to a sacrificial vessel." The researcher watched the initiate's mouth while his mind walked through possible outcomes. Suspicion shifted to alarm. He stepped forward and gripped the folio like a shield. "Who sent you?" "We are the keepers of the count. The initiate, we ensure supply. We ensure the living market." His smile did not reach his eyes. The young scribe reeled. He pressed his palms into his knees as if to pin himself to the stool. The researcher wanted to ask the initiate where the folio had been before their stacks. He wanted to demand a name and a mandate. Instead, he did something else. He reached into his satchel and pulled the pocket watch. Its face was dulled. Hands stopped at an odd slant. He set it on the table, a small, honest object, and let it catch the lamplight. "If you will not tell us the origin," the researcher, "then tell us this. Does reading always take from the reader, or only when the ledger counts it?" The initiate's eyes flicked to the watch. "The ledger counts only what is read aloud and witnessed," he said. "Names must be recorded. Years are measured when ink binds to breath." He deliberately avoided the word sacrifice. Cashin slammed a palm on the table. "So the sect profits from bodies. A prophet is not the word we use. The initiate, we are custodians. We transcribe need into exchange." A scuffle began when the researcher lunged to take the folio and the initiate reached for it at the same time. The scribe tried to stand and was unsteady. He tripped into a rolling cart of low volumes and knocked over a lantern which guttered and flared. The lamp smoke stung their eyes. The folio slid across the table and toward the narrow corridor that led down to the restricted stacks where a stone door remained half closed. The moment the folio moved, a mid-chapter cliffhanger snapped the group's temporary parity. The folio slipped between fingers and began a slow, terrible slide down the corridor, its pages fluttering like rigid wings. Everyone moved in a tumble, Cashin to block the passage, the researcher to seize it, the initiate to intercept. and the scribe reached for the hem of the researcher's robe as if to anchor himself to a single living presence. "Grab it," the researcher barked.
"Do not let it reach the chamber!"
Their hands met on the folio's cover. The initiate's grip was suddenly hard and cold. The researcher felt a shock run up his arm that was not electric, but something like pressure in his bones. He watched ink shift on the ledger as if a new line had been written at the very moment he tightened his hold. They wrestled down the narrow passage. A torch clattered and rolled, smearing a smear of light across the stone. The folio slid toward the heavy door where a ring of sigils carved into the frame seemed to drink the lamplight. For a breath the researcher saw the ledger's margin glow faintly and the neat tally of years change. Cashin's face whitened. His breath left him in a short, shocked exhale. At the threshold of the ritual chamber, the initiate pushed them back and drew a ceremonial knife from his belt. He did not raise it to kill. He raised it to show that he had authority to begin the ceremony. "Stop," he said. "We will bind it now. Stop this petty theft and witness the binding." Inside the circular ritual chamber, carved of stone and lit by low bowls of oil, there was already a ring drawn on the floor with ash and powdered metal. Symbols repeated themselves around the ring. A single round lamp burned in the center. The initiate set the folio on a small altar and placed his satchel beside it. "You cannot bind without witnesses," he told them. "A ledger's tali must be read aloud and acknowledged. Then the transfer can occur." His voice was flat legal. The researcher looked at the folio. He thought of the scribe's face, the whitened strip of hair, the ledger that accounted in years. Suspicion hardened into resolve. He realized that if they allowed the sect to monetize the ledger, the library itself would become a market for bodily time. He also realized that destroying the ledger without testing the final line might allow the knowledge to adapt and reappear elsewhere. The initiate began the ritual slowly, fingers tracing between words, and readers from the darkened archivist gallery leaned over the balustrade to watch. The researcher had a choice. He could allow the ledger to complete another transfer to an unknown vessel, or he could read the final line himself to trigger the undoing the ledger implied, at cost. If you read the final notation, the initiate, recognizing the direction of his thought and stating it plainly, you will transfer the aged tali into yourself. You will pay in years. The ledger will be cleared. The researcher felt his lungs tighten. He put his palm on the folio and felt the paper's skin under his fingers, brittle, faintly warm. He thought of the scribe's plea, the single word "please," and of Cashin's guarded, procedural face. He thought of the initiate's neat, mercantile way of speaking about lives. An emotion shift moved through him. Suspicion to alarm to a cold acceptance. "Are you asking me to sacrifice myself?" he said aloud. His voice was low. When he used the word sacrifice, it had no ritual flourish. It was a tool to name a cost. "You the question, researcher?" The initiate replied, "You know the ledger's mechanism. The choice is not ours to make." Cashin began to speak, then stopped. The young scribe watched the researcher with a hand pressed to his cheek, and eyes wide but unfocused. The researcher put the edge of his spectacles on the folio's margin and read the final line under his breath twice, to gauge its cadence. "If you read, name the ledger's tali aloud. Breath will bind the ink. Years seeded will attach to the reader in equal measure. The ledger will erase." The researcher closed his eyes for a fraction of a second and thought of the pocket watch in his satchel. He thought of the bronze signet ring on his finger and the talisman at his neck. He thought of the small proofs he kept in a leather satchel, notes, names, a ribbon placeholder between pages. He imagined waking with a new H, a thin gray at his temple, the small fine lines at his eyes deeper. He imagined not being able to continue his work. He imagined the scribe alive and whole. He made a choice with minimal ceremony. He set his lips to the folio's spine and read the tali aloud, each syllable pronounced to let ink accept breath 12 years removed. "Ledger cleansed," he said. His tongue pressed against the consonants precisely. He felt wind move in the chamber though no window was open. He felt a pressure settle behind his eyes and then a wrenching draw at the back of his neck, as if something invisible gripped the soft tissues of age and pulled them outward. The physical reaction came immediate and undeniable. His shoulders slumped. His bones ached like a man who had spent years carrying heavy stone. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes pulled taut and deepened. His hair in front of his temple went silver in a single, visible strip. His hands, which had not trembled earlier, now tightened around the folio as if to anchor himself. Around him, breath left people in a sharp intake. The young scribe regressed in color and then filled with blood as the gray faded from his face. He blinked as if waking from a long faint and reached for his throat. Researcher, Cashin began, but his voice was small in the chamber. The initiate stepped back, expression blank, and then, with a sudden, quick decision, he slipped the ceremonial knife back into his belt and moved toward the door. "You chose well," he said quietly, not with praise but with a ledger's impartial appraisal. He turned and left, his robes whispering against stone. After the ritual, the researcher sagged onto the altar step. He could feel his joints protesting the simple act of sitting. His hands trembled when he opened them. Tiny tremors ran down his thumb and forefinger. He pressed his palms to his knees and felt skin that had become thinner overnight. The scribe stood and tried to steady himself. He laughed once, a sharp, brittle sound, and then held his head as if listening for an internal clock. Cashin moved to the folio and inspected it. For the first time since the incident, he spoke without accusation. "Look," he pointed to the pages that had been blank a moment before. Now fresh ink flowed in neat black strokes, a new notation that had not been there earlier. The ledger had rewritten itself, adding a new tally beneath the erased lines. "It adapts," the researcher, voice small, "it rewrites to survive." They carried the folio up to the cliff-edge library balcony as dawn light pooled along the stacks. The researcher walked more slowly than before. Each step required intention. At the balcony, he placed the folio into a locked chest that had belonged to the library's founders. The lock clicked. Cassin took the key and watched the researcher before he turned it, seal it, then cast it down into the stack's abyss. Cassin instructed. His tone had moved from command to a practical accuracy born of fatigue. "Lock it away. Record the event. Tell the council what occurred." The researcher tied the chest and leaned over the balcony. Below, the stacks opened into a yawning dark, where books fell and were lost into a chute of stone. He felt the watch in his satchel and slid a hand into the leather to find the pocket watch. Its face was faulty, hands misaligned. In his haste earlier, he had not set it straight. He held it up between thumb and forefinger and saw that its glass was fine, but the mechanism had a faint sheen of a mineral he did not recognize. Cassin handed the key to the researcher. "Do it," he said. The researcher put the key in the lock, twisted, and then released the chest to the abyss. The chest struck the chute's lip and tumbled, striking wood and stone with a series of dull, resonant clacks that echoed up the stacks. The sound thinned as the chest descended, and finally a last faint slap told of the chest settling against deeper shelves. They closed the balcony doors. The young scribe stood at the threshold, cupping a cloth to his scalp, where hair hung in a thinner strip than before. He had color, yes, but his eyes were empty in a particular way. Not merely tired, but carrying a brittle edge, a knowledge that had been purchased at a private cost. "What now?" The scribe, voice small and direct. Cashin answered. "We document every stroke. We write minutes. We prepare a seal. We will not let this ledger leave our records unexamined." The researcher moved to the library desk and took from his satchel a single page he had removed earlier when his hands had brushed the folio's inner leaves. He had hidden it under his coat without thinking, fingers closing on it with the reflex of a man who preserves proof. The page trembled in his hand. He looked at Cashin and at the scribe. "You must keep the record, researcher." "Cassian, I will," the researcher answered, but he did not hand the page over. Instead, he slid it into an inner pocket against his chest. The action was small, private, a tangible denial of complete transparency. He had paid the ledger's price. He had restored the scribe. He had stopped the initiate's immediate plan. But the folio had rewritten itself. The ledger adapted. A final twist settled over them when the researcher checked his pocket watch again. The hands had straightened by themselves. The second hand made a single, irregular jump and then stopped. He felt a small pulse of dizziness and then steadied himself by gripping the edge of the desk. He set the watch back into his satchel and closed the satchel flap slowly. There was no ceremony to conclude this. They recorded names, times, and signatures in a minute book. They drafted a letter to the council and sealed it. They bound the chest's replacement key and placed it in the restricted ledger of custody. The scribe signed his name in careful, slightly shaky letters. Cassin wrote a notation about the initiate's arrival and left a line for the researcher to append his own account. When the researcher finally opened his mouth, he did not sum up fate or speak in generalities. He one concrete thing to the scribe: rest now. Learn to tie your sleeves differently. Avoid sharp sun in the afternoons. Keep your head covered on the west walk. The scribe blinked and then did as told, fingers fumbling at his collar. He folded his hands and nodded. As morning filled the stacks with thin, precise light, they made choices that defined the library's future. Protocols, seals, witness statements. They had contained an immediate threat, but the ledger's ability to rewrite itself meant containment was temporary. The researcher knew this and accepted the consequence. He had traded years he could not get back for the scribe's life and for evidence that would allow them to argue against the sect's commerce. In the last moment before they parted for the day's work, the researcher stood at the cliff edge one more time. He opened his palm and slid the hidden page from his pocket onto the rail. It was a small slip with a single marginal note in an idiosyncratic flourish. He did not read it aloud. He folded it and tucked it into the inner seam of his robe where no ledger could count it unless he chose to show the page. He buttoned the seam closed and felt the fabric press against his chest as if against a new, private proof. Cashin put a hand on the researcher's shoulder, brief, practical touch. "You kept the record," he said. "I kept a page," the researcher corrected. "I will present it when the council demands proof." The young scribe left for the infirmary to have his head tested and his hair examined by the apothecaries. He walked with a new care, placing his feet deliberately on the steps. He kept his left hand at the base of his skull for the first day, an automatic protection. His future was altered but not obliterated. The folio lay locked in its chest below. The ledger had been contained but not destroyed. The researcher had sealed the chest, but kept a small element of its truth with him. He had paid in time and felt the price in the brittle pull at his joints and the sudden deepening of lines around his eyes. He felt older in the body's measure, but he also felt a clear, cold certainty. Knowledge could be a currency for the vulnerable, and some keepers would count lives against profit. When the researcher closed the balcony doors behind him, a gust of dawn air slid inside and carried with it the smell of ink and dust. He walked to his desk, set his spectacles in place, and reached into the inner pocket for the hidden page one last time. He smoothed it with a thumb, felt the impressions of ink raised on the paper, and then folded it into a smaller square. He did not let himself think of the years he had ceded. He catalogued instead the facts that could be presented. Names, times, the initiate's description, and the ledger's new notation. Outside the library, life moved on. Patrons arrived, apprentices ran errands, and the city washed into a routine that would not notice the ledger's passage unless they made it notice. Inside the researcher, the change was measurable by small things. The pocket watch's irregular tick, the slight ache when he rose from a chair, the way his fingers hesitated over fine penwork. He sat and wrote. He wrote a precise account without flourish. The document he produced that morning would be the instrument that might halt the sect's market if the council heeded it. Or else it would be another piece of evidence swallowed by bureaucracy. He sealed the report and placed it in Cashin's hands. Cashin read it and nodded once. He did not promise the result, he only arranged for witnesses and signatures. The researcher left the archive with his satchel heavier by the secret page and lighter in another way. He had made a choice that had an immediate result. The scribe lived. The ledger did not escape with the initiate. But the folio's new notation meant the ledger would adapt again unless they found a way to alter its mechanism. In the days that followed, the researcher took measured actions. He wrote letters to trusted colleagues, he consulted an apothecary about the scribe's peculiar pallor, and he arranged a private meeting with an elder in the council who had once lectured him on the ethics of dangerous texts. When the council demanded evidence, the researcher presented precise facts and the hidden page. He spoke in controlled sentences, avoiding speculation. He only what he had observed and recorded. The council deliberated. They moved slowly with legal language and a procedural appetite for containment. They voted to restrict access to certain collections, to draft a charter for hazardous texts, and to sanction a small committee to study the ledger's mechanics in secret. The researcher was named to that committee. He accepted without promise of restitution for his years. At the committee's first closed meeting, the elder asked a question that cut to the center. Is it right to use a life to save another? Cassian answered before the researcher could shape a reply. We did not know any other way. Cassian, the scribe, present and quiet, added a sentence. I would rather have my years back than be the proof again. The researcher looked at them both, and then at the sealed folio, now placed in a restricted vault with new wards. He thought of the initiate's steady voice and of the ledger's ability to rewrite itself. He thought of the page in his inner seam and of the watch that ticked irregularly. He put his hand on the folio's chest when the vault door closed and felt the cold hardness of the lock. He felt the weight of decisions. To keep, to hide, to reveal, to pay. He had chosen to pay. That evening, before the library finally emptied, he smoothed his robe and walked the stacks alone. He paused at the cliff edge balcony one last time and watched the gulls wheel over the stone below. He opened his palm and touched the small seam where he had hidden the page. The fabric pressed into his skin. The page pressed into his ribs. He closed his hand and then released it. The pocket watch in his satchel took one irregular tick and then kept time again, slower now, regular in its own way. He tucked the satchel over his shoulder and, with the slow certainty of a man who had counted and paid a debt, walked back toward the lamp-lit reading rooms. The folio remained contained below. The scribe carried his new precautions into the infirmary, and Cassian set new seals. The ledger's threat had not vanished. It had been restrained to a manageable present. The researcher had concluded what he promised to do: preserve evidence and limit harm. He kept one trembling page in his pocket as proof that the ledger could be studied without letting the sect control it. He felt older. He felt the ache in his joints. He felt the pressure of the choice he had made physically in his body. He also felt the quiet, stubborn satisfaction of having acted rather than remain passive. That satisfaction was concrete. A ledger signed, a chest sealed, a set of witness statements filed. He stepped back into the reading room and set his satchel upon the desk, the hidden page pressed close to his heart. He closed the lamp's shade and, as dawn completed its sweep, he began to write the final lines of his report. The last thing he wrote on the page before placing it in the envelope was a single, factual sentence. The ledger transfers measurable years when read. One reader voluntarily absorbed 12 years to restore a living scribe. He folded the page, sealed the envelope, and passed it to Cassian with a steady hand. Cassian took the envelope and nodded. The young scribe, his hair pinned to hide the thinness at one temple, offered the researcher a brief look of gratitude that contained both relief and waking sorrow. The researcher inclined his head and kept his private page where none but he could see it. Outside, the city resumed its rhythm. Inside, the library moved in careful circles around a new protocol. The researcher walked back to his desk, felt the slight familiar ache in his shoulder when he bent, and set the pocket watch on the wood. He steadied his hand, smoothed his robe, and took up a pen to record the ledger's notation he had not yet made public. He did not speak to the room. He acted. The last concrete beat of the chapter was the researcher closing the inner seam and sliding the hidden page back into the pocket against his chest, then closing the satchel and leaving the lamp burning over an empty desk. He had sealed a folio, saved a life, and kept a page. The ledger below would wait. The sect would continue its calculus. He had bought time with his years. The choice was done and the consequences measured in small, physical ways. A stiffer gait, a watch that ticked differently, a strip of hair gone silver. He left the library steps, with his shoulders carrying a new, tangible proof that knowledge could cost years, and that sometimes someone would choose to pay.